Okay, we are recording. Hi, everyone. This is part two of the lecture series that I just did. I set up the awakening for you a little bit, my general thoughts on it. But I wanted to introduce you to a former student who was deeply inspired by the awakening and did a very unusual project. I was just showing, this is Richard Milligan. I was just showing him the passage we went over, which he had a little bit of a different spin on. You know, she's in bed, she's kind of checking out her body. She does a lot of sleeping and a lot of awakening throughout the text, and there's a lot of sensuality. And this led to some questions for Richard. So if I can get you to introduce yourself and explain what about this book inspired you.
Uh, I mean, like you said, I'm Richard. That's it. Like, I don't know what other qualifiers matter. I mean, I find it difficult to say, like, I was interested in the book, because if you remember correctly, like, what was my first thing I said to you when you told me about the awakening?
Yeah, that's true. Richard had just transferred from a community college and he was in my intro to literary study.
Strong working class background, so.
Which now intro to literary study is intro to English studies. It's a different kind. It's actually a multimedia class now. But back when it was just literature, I was teaching the awakening. I was teaching critical approaches to the awakening. So I was going to spend a whole month on the awakening. And
Actually,
yeah,
that
remember?
was that was critical methods, actually.
Oh, it was. That's right. It was critical methods,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
taking
and
it real back there, old school.
and he was sitting there and he just said, I've studied this book before and I have nothing to say about this book. So I'm
Nothing.
like all depressed, like how am I gonna reach this student and make him enjoy the whole month I'm spending on this book? But we managed a point of entry. So can you just explain what got you interested and where you wound up taking it?
So I think if I'm gonna talk about interest or anything, I gotta talk about like what critical methods became for me as a class or as a work, and why. I mean, not only this paper, I have a track record of, I guess you'll say, interesting paper topics. And I think that's because like critical methods taught me like most anything's on the table if you can back it up with research when it comes to discussing things. So of course our discussion of like the similarities between Robert and Edna, the focus on hands and the examining of the body and the laziness and stuff like that, uh, got me quite an interesting nickname around campus, right? Remember people like, oh yeah, you're that masturbating guy, right?
This is
'Cause
quite that's quite a title.
what can I say? My name's Richard too, so I was the masturbating dick, I guess.
So
uh,
obviously, Richard suspects that this text is participating in the kind of anti-masturbatory discourse that's going on at the turn of the century.
so yeah, so I mean, it's flipped to try to be like, oh yeah, I'm just talking about masturbating. But reality, yeah, it's there's a trend in the 19th century of what they call anti-onanist literature or anti-masturbatory things. And again, it's kind of this everything's on the table, and like I remember saying onanism, and you kind of looked at me and going like, "What the hell? What do you know about onanism?" Aside from my my experience in Catholic school, where we did go over the sin of owning, I first learned of John Harvey Kellogg through Crack.com, and so Crack.com is like a website where they share little orders. Maybe some of your students, I don't even know if it's popular anymore, but maybe some of your older students, I say older, like 36 is old, but maybe some students remember it from like the mid 2000s to 2010s for being the place where you find a lot of really crazy kind of lists, like, oh, these crazy books about Nazis or these crazy outbreaks of these things or whatever. And so they would always talk about. There was a lot of them about John Harvey Kellogg. In fact, if any of your members are into the YouTube culture, there's a guy. His name's Cody. He does a YouTube show called Some More News. He used to write for Tract. There's a guy who does a podcast called Behind the Bastards. Robert Evans also used to write for Tract. There's a book and movie written by a guy that I can't think of for Tract. So Tract seems flip. You know what I mean? It's a Mad Magazine style thing, and it seems like a weird place to pull academic sources from. But that's where I was. You know what I mean? Also, like later, I found. Well, I didn't find out, but like I did learn through this project that John Harvey Kellogg's connection to the Seventh Day Adventist religion that my parents were baptized and I was raised in, which is really weird. I mean, these are the ones that every so often say, "Oh, this day is the end of the days, like the rapture's coming," like you know what I mean. The first two times that guy came out and like I did the math in the Bible and the rapture's this day. He was a Seventh Day Adventist, and so the research came from this weird fascination with the guy who's made Kellogg's cereal, who made Kellogg's cereal to help inhibit people's sexual libidos. Because Kellogg's cereal used to include saltpeter, which, you know, if you know anything about prison history as well, saltpeter was used to curtail prisoner sexual impulses as well. So it's this weird. That's why I say, like, it's hard for me to say that, like, because to be honest with you, I haven't even picked up The Awakening since this paper. Uh,
But you will now. You're going to be like, oh, wait a minute, I forgot
yeah. But
where
I'll
it
tell
all
you what,
started.
I'll talk about Kellogg all goddamn day. I love talking about Kellogg. That guy was a weird dude. I tell you right now. I know, there's a ton of meme or an online joke about how white people don't season their food. Uh, and I laugh when I think of that because like that John Harvey Kellogg is 100% on board with that. You know, he said, "Oh, seasoning your food makes it's devilish. It makes you violent and horny and angry, and we don't want that." So he would just eat like boiled chicken and rice like all the time, and
Yeah, well, that was a Puritan thing as well, is not overly seasoning food. And that actually relates to the novel too, because the more Edna awakens, whatever she's doing to awaken, the more she starts to indulge in her appetite. And it almost becomes Epicurean how much she sleeps, how much she languages around with her body, how much she wants to go in the sea, which is a very autoerotic kind of immersion.
yeah, I mean, I close read that sea scene for you, and you know the sea foam and the washing of the waves versus waves of pleasure.
Hmm.
I I think where the paper really became interesting for me was when we discussed how like the ending didn't make sense. You know what I mean? In a story where, and of course, like people have tried to make sense of the ending. Oh well, it just meant that a girl like Edna couldn't live in that society, or, the patriarchy could. And like I think there's merit to either of those. I mean, I think there's merit to any fucking reading. Sorry, any reading that you do as long as you've had research. But I think that was where the question was like, well, why did she go through all this like self-liberating stuff just to walk off into the ocean? And then that got me looking into to Kate Chopin, who was, a 19th century feminist, you know what I mean? But like part of 19th century feminism was this moralism. There was a whole anti-sex contingency in early feminism, you know what I mean? And I don't mean to disparage early feminists like that's a bad thing too either. I just want to say that like there is this kind of crusade like that it's where we get this Madonna whore complex too. You know what I mean? This discussion
Right.
that women are supposed to be pure creatures is still kind of enforced in early feminism, but that's not a criticism of early feminism. You know, it's if there's anything I've been learning in my current academic studies, it's that incrementalism is key. You know what I mean? And so every
Right.
step of the way, we go from purity of early feminism to 2020s. You gotta eat butt. You know what I mean? It's just that's where we're at now.
Well,
Um,
I think in this text there's a lot of there's both an attraction to the Madonna figure because you've got Madame Ratignolle who's thinking about another baby all the time. And I read a wonderful article about how Victorian women used motherhood as a weird coded way to actually talk about desire and sexuality, but it was the only way they could really talk about it. So her enthusiasm for getting pregnant, which Edna finds kind of off-putting. She thinks those issues shouldn't be out on the table so much at first. It's almost seductive for her to hear that discourse kind of paraded. And then there's at the same time a profound repulsion from that because that's biological destiny, which is exactly what feminists wanted to avoid, right?
yeah, but that's also the Puritan thing too, right? Like the Puritans. only understood sexual desire as desire to have children. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, was it? You're really making me dig into my my Litz One type days. But isn't Bradstreet famous for poems like that? You know what I mean? Where it's like
Right.
mass desire, but like Puritans. You know what I mean?
Right. And female desire in particular has always been seen as dangerous and threatening to
Mhm.
social conventions,
And
primarily because of, patriarchy and property law. But can you, before we sort of conclude, can you just talk a little about Robert? Because I like your reading of Robert. I'm a little resistant to seeing infidelity in these texts as a real solution. I feel like the men are just kind of these tokens of what's going on within her. And we had noticed that Robert and Edna look so much alike. So, what was your take on that?
oh man, you kind of taught me off guard with this one. uh,
Because they're the same age exactly, which
Yeah,
is
I mean, well, that was it. Like we were talking about all the languishing and the hands and the bed, and then we kind of talked about how she, how she felt connected to Robert because they were similar, right? They looked the same. Um, there's this passion between the two of them. You know what I mean? That's like, yeah, that's masturbatory, right? Like, it's clear she's into it. Like her only her only attraction to him is this like attraction to self. You know what I mean?
right. And she keeps seeing
Which
a naked man on the beach in her mind as she kind of starts to experience pleasure. And my sense has always been that it's not a romantic image, but an image of herself without clothing on, which is kind of what she keeps trying to do, is to get rid of all this female clothing and just be, she's got a very masculine body, and just be that body on the beach and swim. So I see it as more a piece of herself than I do about
who
another
what,
man.
what was the guy she banged? Who did she end up having sex with? Sorry, should have said
She
it so
she winds
fast.
up having an affair with Arabin,
Arabin. I couldn't remember that name. Right,
who's
and
he's
Arab,
really just a player. He's really
yeah,
not important.
and he's also like, he's also bluster and bravado and look at me. You know, what I mean? He's the kind of guy that will brag all day about how big his member is, but when you get in there, you don't know how to use it. You know what I mean?
And they're both very boyish. Like, what I think is interesting about the way the novel pits Edna and Robert against each other is that they're the same age. Edna will turn 29 on her last party, and he's turning 29. But you get the sense that her life is kind of over and his is just beginning, because he's going to go to Mexico and do whatever he wants, and he's got mobility. And she,
Right,
I
yeah.
guess, while she's 29, she's just like sinking.
Well, of course, and I mean I think that that's also kind of like what jumpstarts her like dissatisfaction with Mr. Pontellier, right? Is that like, oh shit, this guy who's just like me, my age and everything, he gets to go off and see the world, and here I am shackled with kids and a husband and just a life. I think that's what it is. If anything, like because I remember when I presented this in your class, and I got this kind of attitude at first, like, oh yeah, you just want to reduce the feminine hero to she's just masturbating. But like, I think it's more about like what it means to possess oneself. I hate to delve too crass, but I mean, I'm a bit of a crass person. There's a rap song by a rapper named IDK, and it's called Porno. And I'll clean it up a bit for the audience, but like the line is like, the Bible says killing somebody and masturbating is the same, and he's like, that's ridiculous. You know what I mean? And again, I've really cleaned that up.
I'm
uh,
sure. Thank you.
but like that's kind of this notion that we have that somehow like self love or self pleasure is dirty in such a way that it's up there with like the most unforgivable of sins. You know what I mean? Murder. The full offense. That and it's even more pernicious in a society where a woman feels trapped at 29 for her to dare to step out and do that. And then
Right.
again, it all goes back to the Kellogg stuff. I mean, the man Kellogg, right? You'll remember our wonderful little text script we wrote about the play, right?
Right.
The frustration of Miss Kellogg as her husband sat on their honeymoon night in another room writing a book about why little girls shouldn't masturbate. I mean, I know,
Because that's what we all want to do on our honeymoon.
And you know, she was as into the faith as he was, so it's not like, you know, when you research it, you know, it's not like, you know, I guess she was happy with that, but like we look at that today and we're just like, oh god, that sounds so alien and foreign, you know what I mean? But I think that's the entirety of a society that altogether restricts sex, especially for women. You know what I mean? Like there is no time. I mean, today we're dealing with it now, right? You know me and my reference to pop culture, right? I mean, that's probably why you put me on here, right? We looked at issues today with one of the number one songs in the world right now is a song called "Wet Ass P Word," right? Uh, and I refer to the commentators, specifically like Ben Shapiro, but a lot of right wing commentators are coming out like they're appalled at the notion that women would talk about their sexuality in such vibrant ways. And Ben Shapiro famously came out and said, like, oh, what does she mean? It's wet and dripping. She must have a disease. And the internet's kind of seized on it. Actually, Ben, that means you've never given your wife an orgasm. You know what I mean? But it's stunning today that even today, like, there's this kind of surprise about female desire and sexuality, right? Whether it's you know, again, back to the pop culture stuff. Big Mouth, the episode where they, you know, where the girls are like, yeah, girls get horny too, and the one guy's brain explodes, right? And they're all kind of like, what the hell do you mean, right? And then, you know, it's also the romance novel thing, right? We've always kind of looked down our nose at romance novels, but I mean, you know, my roommate loves her romance novels. She calls them her bodice rippers, but like we are we are very messed up when it comes to desire in this country. You know what I mean? Very, not just
Especially
the country in the world, especially female desire.
your
It's
your perspective on the awakening. I was rereading it and thinking it's such a different text in quarantine, right? This kind of closing in of walls. And I also am doing the yellow wallpaper, and that's a quarantine text, right? But as I was reading it from your point of view, I was also thinking about there's a lot of critical articles on Edna as a proto-lesbian character, or what Elizabeth LeBlanc calls a metaphorical lesbian character, which is that she's just so put off by all the other kinds of sexual expression that she just winds up grasping at whatever she can. And Mademoiselle Reese, I don't know if you remember her, she's the pianist in the novel, and she's seen as a kind of proto-lesbian character. And there's all these scenes where Edna is at Mademoiselle Reese's house reading letters from Robert that were sent to Mademoiselle and not to Edna. And there's this really weird way, you know, Eve Sedgwick's perspective on the romance novel, that women are just tokens between men,
yeah.
work out their desires and their sort of game of chess. Those scenes now seem to me, with your perspective, very much that Robert's just a token in some kind of discourse between women. They're all working out their sexuality really differently. Mademoiselle's really into her art. Edna's really into her own body and into sleep and in the sea. And then Madame Ratignolle's really into her pregnancies. She's really into pregnancy, which for the Victorian period is a pretty racy topic
Yeah,
to make it so
yeah.
out there, right? So I do agree with you that this text just screams kind of what it means to own yourself, possess yourself. I was looking at Their Eyes Were Watching God. I happen to be doing a paper on Hurston, and I've been looking at this a lot. And I don't know if you've read this, but the character at the very beginning masturbates under a pear tree again and again and again. And it's like, you know, she's looking at the birds and the bees, and waves of pain and pleasure are coming over her. And then her grandmother, worried that she's too self-indulgent, marries her off to an old guy, Logan. And she keeps coming back to her grandmother going, I don't feel like I did at the pear tree. So it's this like codified thing that it's just not, you know, it's not about the sexuality so much as how do you define yourself in terms of self-pleasure. It's just the way you can be a being in the world. What disturbs me about Edna is how much she's compared to an animal all the time. And it makes me think that maybe the novel's a little bit resistant to her perhaps onanistic sensibility, just because she is kind of spiraling into a decline as if she's too self-indulgent. So do you have a final word on that? Like, do you think the novel is like, yay, go Edna, or is it kind of closing in on her indulgence?
Well, so well, to get to the Cedric thing and stuff like that, like, you remember I did include Cedric's Jane Austen and the Masturbating Girl from her book Tendencies, which is a breakdown of that. And she kind of says that, like, the masturbator was like the center of remapping individual identity, will, attention, and privacy. And it's also like the proto form of modern sexual identity, right? So, like, yeah, I think there is, like, if anything, outside of like what I feel about the moralism of 19th century feminism, and maybe take Chopin's role in or outside of that, is that ultimately, like, Edna's awakening happened too soon. You know what I mean? I guess, like, the moral end is that, like, her self destruction is the result of her own hand, right?
Right.
Uh,
Right. Right. I
but
mean, but it's also seen as very passive. It's not like she takes a stand and can't live anymore. She just kind of lets it happen.
yeah, and I don't. If you'd have asked me back then, I'm sure I would have had some, like, perfect answer for this. But, like, I don't know. This is over 10 years ago. I wrote this paper, and it's like, I'm a drastically different person. You know what I mean?
Right.
Uh, 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 I think I can't ignore the moralistic implications of it, in that, like, ultimately, yes, letting yourself fall too deep into self pleasures, echoing anti-owniness discourse of the time, is what this is.
Right.
It's like when they talk about, like, cigarettes or drinking as a slow suicide. You know what I mean? Well, that's what this was. And everybody drank and everybody smoked back then, but the real slow suicide is touching yourself. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
Again, that's all Kellogg's entire book is, that, like, oh, the masturbator is languid and they lose vigor for life, and they lay around and they get syphilis and they go
Right.
blind, and all the crazy shit that attaches to it. But, like, ultimately the thing is that I think in the realm of the awakening, as it was written at the time, was supposed to be a parable about, if you don't play your role in life, you get too caught up in self desire or self pleasure or just desire in general, without realizing how you're. Because that's just it. Everybody, Madame Ratignolle, the pregnant lady, everybody plays their roles in life. Everybody does what they're. Or no, whoever said, the artist and this other that. It's the hierarchy of needs, right? Everybody kind of does what they're supposed to do, and then Edna's not sure what she's supposed to do, so she starts trying to figure it out. But, like, ultimately, that's the 19th century equivalent of the slippery slope argument, right?
Right.
So I
Right.
think I think it becomes a moralist text if you look at it in the historical framework. I think from a modern perspective, if we, death of the author this thing, yeah, it's 100% about the notion that sexuality being so limited is more destructive than the sexual acts themselves, because ultimately that's what it is. She's not allowed to do this. She's asked her, I'm sure she feels outside because of this. There's a secret shame. I mean, we all, it's, even in 2020, if we talk about this stuff more openly, the joke that, like, 80% of men masturbate, 20% lie. You know what I mean? Like, that
Right.
that we're still ashamed to talk about it in any sense of the way, and not just masturbation, but sex in general. Yeah, like, I still don't even think we're there. I guess. So I think if we read it as a classical parable about masturbation, yeah, that's what you could do. If you're a historicist, go nuts. But if we look at it in a modern lens and what it means for us today, it's really to show, like, the how sexual identity does shape our worlds. You know what I mean? How it's important for us to consider not just how we feel about our sexuality, whether it's self sexuality or sexuality between others, but, like, how we kind of tend to judge others for their sexuality, or how that judgment of others creates our own anxieties about our own sexuality. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I don't want to talk about doing that thing because somebody might think that I'm like this person, or whatever the case may be. Or I
Right.
heard somebody say this about this person, but I'm into that, so I better keep it quiet.
And in this world, it's a shock if you don't keep your calling hours on Tuesday. So imagine going any further than that, right? Yeah. So I think this has been really helpful. I think the students will really enjoy it. According quarantine is making me get as creative as possible. I'm probably going to start contacting all kinds of people so they don't have to stare at me and my talking head all the time.
Well, now I'll have an online, like, recorded digital representation of me as the masturbator guy. So
Yes, and it'll be in my video library, which is getting quite big. I never meant to do this for a living, but here we are.
I'm never gonna escape this. This is my life now. I'm forever.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording to let them go, and then we can chat for a moment on our own. So bye, everyone. I'll do another video. They wanted one per book. So I guess the next one will be probably Hurston.